Good morning, everyone. I'm Rundong Ning. I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow here at the Institute. Today, I'm honored to chair the very first panel, which, as David just mentioned, will be on Africa. We have three distinguished speakers covering different regions of countries of Africa and their connections with China. They are Adedeji, Aina, Ademola from the Obafemi Awolowo University, Nigeria, Wincharles Coker from the University of Cape Coast, Ghana, and Conrad Masabo from University of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. And after the three presentations, we will be joined by a discussant, Justin Haruyama from the University of British Columbia, Canada. And each presentation will be about 15 minutes and also as well as for the discussant. And after the presentations and the discussion, we will open the floor for the public discussion. So now, without much further ado, let's welcome our first speaker, Adedeji and Ademola, to present his paper, Chinese Missionary Movements and the Spread of Christianity in Africa, a study of the impact of BRI on religious networks in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Nigeria.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. My name is Adedeji Ademola. I'm a PhD researcher at the Obafemi University in Nigeria. So I'll be speaking about Chinese missionary movements and the spread of Christianity in Africa, a study of the impact of BRI on religious networks in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Nigeria. So I'm going to Okay, so basically, the study is divided into 4 sections. I'm going to look at China and Africa over time, past and present. Then I'll look at the theoretical framework, as well as talk about Chinese missionary movement in Africa, looking at Kenya, Nigeria, and Ethiopia. Then I will talk about the local responses and implications of China missionary activities in Africa. The BRI, of course, it's a development strategy by China, to go into economic cooperation with the rest of the world, basically. So in Africa, we have about 52 countries that have signed and have understanding with the Belt and Road Initiative. So the BRI, fortunately, as Professor Palmer mentioned, we've been talking about the economic dimension and the political dimension of it, but not much study has been done on the religious aspect. So I kind of look at how the Chinese missionaries came to Africa as a result of this development strategy, the BRI. So, and you will know that China has the largest diaspora group globally, about 46 million. And of course, China is also an emerging vital development collaborator on the African continent. There is this expedition done by Zheng He about 600 years ago, which, and then the other reports by Gavin Menzies, 1421, the year China discovered the world, which detailed the report of the gathering of kings and envoys in Beijing to pay homage to Emperor Zudi, the son of heaven. I've read some other literature that said that actually report is a fiction. So, but the next point actually is not a fiction. Sino-African relations improved as a result of the Cold War. Of course, you remember the war, the Cold War, the ideological rivalry between the West and the East, the West and its allies, and the East and its allies. So there was this group, non-allied movement formed during that time, which China is also a member, and some other parts of the of the developing world, Africa, Asia, Latin America, basically. So, but there is this foreign policy, of course, which China has been having from Mao Zedong internationalism obligation, down to President Xi Jinping fivefold approach to relations with Africa. And it's all about going out strategy. So, and of course, we also have a forum established to have, to give a platform for China and Africa to cooperate further. So the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation was established and has been on for a time, even before the launching of the BRI. So I look at theory of globalization and cultural exchange. Globalization, of course, is a growing state of global interdependence and interconnectedness. And Muller in 2011 stated that Christianity played a role in the creation of globalization. Of course, if you look at the major religions of the world, they are all delocalizing. People going from their base outside, proclaiming the gospel. Let me put the gospel outside their base and to all major parts of the world. And it's also emphasizes the theory of cultural exchange, the reciprocal impact that Chinese and African cultures exert on one another. So if you look at Africa, basically, there are about 52 countries, 54. And originally, Africans have their own religion, the African traditional religion. We have so many African traditional religions. I don't have the number right now. So, but in Nigeria, we have people worshiping Ogun, Obatala, and so on. But then came Islam and then Christianity. So Christianity was brought into Africa basically by the West. And a number of churches were founded. But as a result of the BRI, a lot of Chinese came into Africa. Even before the BRI, there were Chinese in Africa. But as a result of the BRI, there was, a lot of Chinese coming into Africa for economic reasons, basically. So, but as time goes by, a number of churches were founded by South Koreans, by the Chinese missionaries from Hong Kong and Taiwan. So the Chinese have been immensely involved, for instance, in the construction of churches in Kenya. Then religious activities of the people from China and Taiwan seems to be in line with those of Korean Christians. What do I mean? You find out that the South Koreans, they came before the Chinese in their missionary activities. But I discovered, and I'm going to talk about that in my findings, that most of them came majorly for economic reasons. Then maybe they are looking at a platform to come together, to fellowship, and for them to discuss issues of common interest. And so they started having religious activities. And of course, Africa is also a religious continent, especially Nigeria. We have over 200 million people, basically divided between the Islam and Christianity, about 95%, So they are religious people. And so most of them must have come across Africans or have attended African churches or mosques. Then there are 35 churches presently planted in Africa by the Chinese, and they have about 1,190 members. If you look at the table, we have South Africa where, the Chinese are majorly residing, and they have 15 churches planted by the Chinese mainly. We have 500 members. In Nigeria, we have 2. With 30 members. In Mauritius, we have 3 churches with 250. Then moving to Botswana, where you have 1, Tanzania 1, Uganda 2, Namibia 2, and then Kenya 3. This is a theological seminary opening ceremony. At its Africa Chinese Covenant Church. And the missionaries in China, they are planning to broaden, to expand further into Africa by having at least 20,000 missionaries in Africa by 2030. Then I discovered that there is a printing company in China, of course, supported by US, where they print 12 million Bibles in a year. Most of these Bibles are used in Africa. In Kenya, I want to look at the case studies now. Starting with Kenya. Kenya, of course, is a country in East Africa and home to several international organizations. Christianity predominates in Kenya, about 82%, and is the third African Belt and Road country. Kenya has enjoyed a lot of financing from China. You know, in Kenya now we have Mombasa and Lamu Deep Water Ports, railway from Mombasa to Nairobi, all financed by China. In 2017, China became Kenya's largest trading partner, according to March. Then Chinese Christians in Kenya are able to penetrate into the local economy faster than non-Christians. Kenyans are learning Mandarin, while Chinese are also learning Swahili. You know, there is this cross-cultural exchange, and Chinese even got married to Kenya like what we have here. You know, this was a major event that happened in Kenya in 2019, where Liang Yonggu and Karen Njiri were married near Mount Kenya. It became a very big news in Africa at that time. In Nigeria, Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa, of course, with over 200 million people, and China's important trading partner. They have established diplomatic relations since 1971. And in Nigeria, when you walk into major stores in Lagos, in Port Harcourt, in Abuja, you see Chinese everywhere. And they have their brands, the Big Trees, Huawei, Good Imperial Restaurant. And they have this particular Chinatown in Lagos, which I visited during the course of doing this research. The Chinese have also invested in the Nigerian economy. I don't have much time. Chinese missionaries can be found in indigenous churches in Nigeria. I've attended some of these churches, especially in Lagos. Anglican Catholics, you will find them. And of course, they have this Chinese Christian fellowship in Lagos. Let me just read this because it's important to my finding. According to what they have on the website in Lagos, this church is in Ikoyi in Nigeria. The Chinese Christian Fellowship is a lively Christian fellowship, an independent and non-denominational church, which comprises of Chinese brothers and sisters from different parts of the world, China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. It serves as a church for Chinese Christians in Lagos, Nigeria, to worship God, learn his word, and live a life that pleases God. It is an avenue to provide an oasis and fellowship for Chinese Christians, to encourage, support, and edify one another, especially in the challenging Nigerian environment. In Ethiopia, we have like one Chinese church with at least 10 members. Sorry, I'll go to my findings now. Most of the Chinese churches, apart from in South Africa, what I discovered, they operate in closed circles. And I tried to ruminate on that, and I discovered, I read in some literature that in China, they have several underground churches. I don't know the reason, but maybe that idea also, or that psychological effect on them made them to be operating in closed circles, because I couldn't even gain access to the Chinese Christian fellowship in Lagos. And maybe because they speak Mandarin, a lot of people in Nigeria do not understand the language. Of course, some Chinese speaks they can communicate in English. Then most of the churches that were founded gather their people and encourage one. It doesn't seem to be like a fully missionary work at first, but it's turning that way increasingly. Then there could be more Chinese in Africa in the future. This is just a projection. The Belt and Road Initiative was a major influence in the work of the missionaries. Let me go to my conclusion, and I will just read the last part. Chinese missionaries take part in a process of cultural learning, and exchange as they adapt to local conditions and help spread Christianity, enhancing the fabric of religious practices and identities. In the end, this study highlights the potential for harmonious cultural engagement between nations as they embark on cooperative journeys as exemplified by the Belt and Road Initiative. It also deepens our understanding of the complex interaction between globalization, religious influence, and development strategy. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Adedeji, for your wonderful paper and presentation. As someone just came back from Kenya, your presentation really give me exciting new initiatives to do for my next trip is to visit some of those Chinese churches, if possible. So now let's welcome our second presenter of this panel, Wincharles Coker, presenting his paper entitled Commodifying Religion in Western Africa, a deconstruction of the syncretic formula of China.
Thank you, and good morning. So we have reworked the title to read The Rhetoric of China's Exploitation of Religion in West Africa. And we came by this final title or working title as a result of the findings that were emerging from our research. Okay, so I would like to start by playing this video. I don't know if I can start for me. Thank you. So. Double click. If you double click, yeah, sure. Are you online? Sure. So sorry, I need to.
Apparently, it's not only the white man that figured out that religion is the best way to enslave an average African man. Even the Asians have also keyed into the religion-crazy attitude of Africans as a way into the African man's pockets.
For those that have 50 euros, rush forward. For those that have 50 euros, quickly rush forward. Rush forward. For those that have 50 euros, rush out quickly. Quickly. For those that have 50 euros. And if you don't have 50 euros, rush with 20 euros. Quickly. Come on, put it in the hand. Quickly. Karabo Shantalababa. Send down fire. Holy Ghost fire. Send down fire. Oh, send down fire. The Holy Ghost. Holy Ghost fire. Send down fire. Send down fire. Holy Ghost fire. Send down fire. Send down fire. Holy Ghost fire.
When 50 euros no work, good, 20 euros, fast, fast. All money na money. Wetin Musa no go see forget. Jesus. Don't get me wrong, there is absolutely nothing wrong with having a foreigner establish church business.
Sorry if you don't mind. I know it's getting interesting, but I would have to start all this thing. So we argue in this paper that this is not the domain of the traditional Chinese man in contemporary West Africa. We would argue in our presentation that we draw on the word exploitation in two main senses. Exploitation to mean mining, trying to get down to natural resources, and exploitation from its connotative implication. And therefore, as the video you watch just portrayed, this is just the transcription of the video. But yeah, in this paper, we want to interrogate capitalist Chinese migrants workers' exploitation of religion as an economic resource in West Africa, drawing ideas from rhetorical theory, geopolitics, and African post-colonial studies. We would argue that even though China's strategy in Africa is to expand infrastructure and development to the rest of Africa, we realize that to choose Professor Palmer's choice word, there are entanglements. And so what happens when the average Chinese man, in their attempt to get into Africa and do business, get involved in religion? We argue that far from being a spiritual exercise, Chinese involvement in religion is much more a business. And so that is what we were trying to argue. Now we know, just as Adedeji said, that relations between China and Africa dates back, way back into time. And from the perspective of Africa, it's not just about economics and geopolitics, it involves much more. However, scholars are conflated on the role of China and its involvement in Africa. While some African scholars believe that the initiative is positive, others like Zeliza argue that China's massive role in Africa portends doom. Others believe that if Africa does not take care, there's a possibility of neo-colonization or neo-colonialism to recur in Africa. Now, we wouldn't want to talk about that. We want to simply look at what is China's role in the use of religion in Africa. All right, so we draw on critical case study design to look at three main case studies. The use of religion in China from the perspective of what we call reverse proselytization. We also looked at China's use of music as a way of getting into business, and then Chinese will get into the heartland of African spirituality by way of getting stools, or getting enskinned, or getting installed as chiefs in Africa. So we draw on 3 videos from YouTube using the process of rhetorical deconstruction to get into the main. So we have already seen this video, but I want to do a little deconstruction of this video. So in what we term reverse proselytization, we here are talking about how the average Chinese man gets into business by way of selling religion to Africans. We know from the work of John Mbiti, 1979, that the average African is what he described as incurably and obdurately religious, and therefore involving Africans in spirituality will be an easy way to get into the hearts of the African. So for example, the research reveals that this, what we call Chinese capitalist methodology, works on the assumption that Africans are largely religious people, mainly economically deprived, and therefore may be willing to do just as anything to get out of their economic quagmire. In this YouTube video, the viewer is made to witness a rare uptake of pastoral work by an unnamed Chinese pastor in a Ghanaian congregation. The Yahoo preacher presented at the beginning of this paper is the same pastor being referenced here at this section. Remember, he is enthusiastically urging the congregation to sow seeds of 50 and 20 euros in order to attract God's blessings. A deconstruction of the video clearly reveals a transactional act between the Chinese pastor and his Ghanaian congregation. The business transaction is reminiscent of a story in the Bible where Simon Magus, a sorcerer in Samaria, sought to offer money to apostles Peter and John in an exchange of a gift of miracle to heal the sick. Acts 8:9-24. The story says that the apostles took strong exception to the business deal and cursed him. It goes without saying that for conservative Christians, God's giftings are not for sale for both the seller and buyer. As is noted, freely have you received, freely must you give. In fact, the term Yahoo, as used in the West African popular imaginary, commonly refers to online fraudsters and their fraudulent activities. A close analysis also reveals the insensitivity, perhaps, of the man, given that he was asking for 50 euros and 20 euros in a country where cedis are used as the currency. A legion of scholars in critical and post-colonial studies have sought to dispel the myth espoused by Hegel that Africans may be infantile in thought and far from capable of managing their own affairs. The first case study, therefore, presents a binary of exploitation versus plunder on the one hand, and conquest versus hopelessness on the other hand. Now we move to the second one, where we look at the use of repackaging African gospel songs. Repackaging African gospel songs. So in this, we realize that there are Chinese workers in Ghana who are beginning to learn how to sing in Ghanaian songs, or in using the local languages to the congregants in Ghana, and this becomes a way of getting to the hearts of many Ghanaians. The third one is perhaps for me the straw that breaks the camel back. For many Africans, kinship and traditional rulership is a spiritual matter. It is not just about politics. It's about embodying the soul and the history of the people. And so when we have an uptake of traditional rulership by Chinese foreigners or Chinese workers, it becomes a difficult issue to understand. And so we also looked at that. Now, in conclusion, we want to argue that the findings need to be understood within the context of the limitations, because, for example, we could not interview the Chinese in the study. We were limited by way of getting in touch with them. It was a very difficult thing to do. So this was our basic deconstruction of the text, devoid of their own voices, and we find this a big limitation in the work. We also realized that we could have done a far extensive work given if we had the time, because similar phenomena can be found in Nigeria as well, where Chinese are also becoming chiefs and rulers in Nigeria. So we want to encourage scholars of Sino-African relations to explore this particular aspect, even as we look at the religious dimension of Sino-African relations. We could also be looking at the economics of religion in Africa. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Wincharles, for this wonderful talk. As a Chinese, I still remember when there's a new Chinese chief emerged in Africa, there are lots of news coverage of them and covering how they did good to the local societies. But I think it's definitely interesting to see it through a religious perspective. And now let's welcome the third speaker of our panel, Conrad Masabo, whose paper is entitled "The Role of China's Contractors in the Construction of Churches in Africa. Is BRI Serving Christian Evangelization Mission?"
Sorry, excuse me. I will need to spend a few minutes to settle the PowerPoint materials. Just wait a few minutes.
Good morning. I'm Conrad Masabo from Tanzania. I'm currently an assistant lecturer at the University of Dar es Salaam. So welcome to my paper. And I've been researching on China infrastructure projects in Africa. And this paper I'm presenting is like a follow-up to what I've been doing. I had been researching on China infrastructure financing and development in Tanzania. Now, in the course of my research, I realized that there is a new development in China, infrastructure financing and development, and that is leading to issues related to religion. So I have several issues, but I may skip some of them. But one of the issues is that the Chinese engagement with Africa is now undergoing some shifts, especially we used to know about China's role in road, railways, and bridge construction, but recently it have advanced into a real estate sector. And now within real estate sector, China is now further going to constructing of the churches. And while constructing railways, roads is not something new, but this construction of churches is a new development in China-Africa engagement. And that's what is interesting to my research. So throughout the history, the major visibility that there have been two, in terms of infrastructure financing, China, there had been two major shifts in Africa. One is the view that there is capital accumulation through investment and market, but major which links with the BRI is that as China tries to deal with the internal problem of industrial overcapacity, in the long run, I'm arguing that this very solution may lead to China engaging into other fields. And this is the field of evangelization through the infrastructure that it will be constructing. So major issues that puzzles me is that China professes to be agnostic, but its major activities in Africa might lead to saving evangelization. And that's now the question is, many argue that China is in Africa for the economic logic, but the question is it true that only by pursuing infrastructure, China will limit to end with economics? Now, the question is whether we can limit these effects of economics not to transfer to religion and evangelization. The other puzzle is, can we separate between politics, business, and religion? Or is it possible to exclude BRI zeal for infrastructure development and the logic for people-to-people ties and the connectivity from saving Christian evangelization? So those are some of the issues that have attracted me. So framing it within the global China, the issue that whether China is a global power, for many scholars, is no longer a question. China have demonstrated some aspects of being global power. And there are two dynamics: selective adaptation and the reshaping of the global norms and institutions. And this argued by Wang, who say that China deals with the world as a global power in two ways. One is selectively reshaping the world and also adapting some aspects. So there are ways China adapts what is already presented in the global world, but also selectively reshapes the global world in the way it deals with the global world. So one area is that China now is currently actively involved in writing of the rules of global governance, and this has been revealed by several authors. So BRI is one of the major global projects, is what makes me to follow up this implication of China as a global power in Africa. So in 2013, there was a launch of BRI, and BRI is now expanding from two major focus on Silk Road Belt and the Maritime Silk Road. Now it is expanding to areas of health, digital, and now there is another project that they call Polar Silk Road. So even the BRI itself is now expanding. So its expansion is likely to have an impact in many other aspects. So, and this BRI particularly, some argue that was a response to deal with the effects of what China did in terms of responding to global financial crisis, because with the global financial crisis, China invested heavily in industrial development, and some of the areas of industrial development were infrastructure-related industries, which now they have output that cannot be consumed within China, and China looks for alternative ways to deal with that challenge that is happening in its. So there are major 5 elements in the BRI, but my interest is in the second and the last one, and the fifth one. And it is argued that BRI is among the most debated, discussed China's policy of recent times. If you compare with many other policies, it have received attention, both negative and positive. However, some present it as a unified project, but some argue that it is not that the case. Some have argued that it is having a lot of fragmentations and many other aspects that are related to it. So also it has several myths. Some of it is to think that is a project designed to trick the participant, something that China is having control over all the BRI projects, and something that countries are realizing that China's intention with BRI is negative and they are pulling out. But the fact is there are more countries joining BRI as opposed to the argument advanced. So if you take the context of China infrastructure development, some statistics, there have been several developments. Like Deloitte reports about 34% of the infrastructure construction in Africa by 20 were by China. where it financed 14%, 14.8% of the projects that were undertaken in Africa. So there are several kilometers of railway lines, several kilometers of highway, bridges, construction of ports, and also in power plants. This is a table I developed from Deloitte report from 2013 to 2021 that shows the trend in terms of building, funding, and ownership that China is. And this is particularly in East Africa, where will be my focus for this study. Now, in order to link this development with the theme of the conference, I looked at the centrality of religion in Africa. And as Mbit long argued, Africa is considered to be notoriously religious, that Africans cannot live without religion. And that being the fact, is true that when everything comes from China, there is no way Africa will live religion. And in the long run, there is likelihood that China activities might serve the interest of religion. This idea was further advanced by late Magesa, who also wrote in 10 years ago, a book called What is Not Sacred, and is questioning whether there are any African aspect of life that can be considered not sacred. It's like awakening the idea of Mbiti of showing the centrality of religion in Africa. In that regard, China's presence in Africa always encounters religious Africa. So if it encounters religious Africa, there is the likelihood that its activity might impact religion. Now, there are three major developments in relation to China as a global power and its infrastructure projects in Africa. One is that currently China is winning a lot of tenders in church construction, particularly in Kenya. Also, Chinese contractors are winning to build church-related buildings. Also, there is another previous activity that China had been engaged in printing Bibles. The question is, does it mean that China is sincerely want to put Africa closer to God? That probably might be the answer. So there are two major companies that have been involved in construction of churches and church-related buildings in Africa, and both for emerging churches and established churches, Catholic and the Lutherans. So you can see that that is a serious impact that China is having on infrastructure. So they had been built several infrastructure in Kenya also, both for Catholic and the Lutheran. Now the question is, does this translate into evangelization mission? It is true that while China activities it takes economic logic, the consequence is likely to be serving the interest of evangelization. Because once you build the church, once you print the Bibles, those translate into evangelization. So that's the logic I'm trying to develop here. So in conclusion, I can say BRI role in transforming religious setup in Africa is evident in three ways. Through construction of churches, through construction of church-related buildings, and through BRI infrastructure development, especially people-to-people ties and connectivity, where cultural exchange will be evident and cross-influencing. Equally, other contribution is in the Bible printing. However, I may not say that this argument is conclusive. There are other areas that the research may further advance, especially the contribution of Africa to Chinese who are in Africa. So as my brother has presented, Chinese now adapting to religious practice and other cultural aspects in Africa. So that's what I was trying, that might be an area to further advance. Having said that, I say thank you.
Thank you, Masabo, for this wonderful talk. I also remember some of my friends told me about their experience of constructing mosque in Senegal. So I think this kind of construction work is a major way of engaging with religion in Africa by Chinese actors. So for now, let's welcome Justin Haruyama to comment on these three wonderful presentations. He will join us through Zoom. Okay, let's steam him up.
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be joining you all virtually through Zoom today. And it's an honor to be able to give comments on these three distinguished scholars and their very exciting and very interesting papers. I have to say, as someone who has tried to study religious connections between Chinese migrants and Zambians, looking at all three of these research papers was absolutely fascinating and really, really exciting for me. I think that the three presenters today all raise really fascinating questions in the field of contemporary studies of China-Africa relations, especially, and particularly as David Palmer was suggesting at the beginning, looking beyond the political economic angle that is so often focused on. And I think particularly all three of these papers bring up this really interesting issue of a couple of the papers cited the theologian John Mbidi, who describes Africa as a profoundly religious continent. With multiple religions, of course, African traditional religions, as well as Christianity and Islam are major ones. So on the one hand, you have profoundly religious societies in many parts of Africa. And on the other hand, China, which is an officially atheist state, and which severely restricts religious proselytization and missionary activity within its own borders. And so the bringing of these two together and considering of the religious connections between the two of them, I think raises profoundly fascinating and exciting questions that I'm really excited for all three of these research projects as they develop and as we hear more of the results from this research. So I think what I would like to focus my discussion comments on in this brief time is sort of bringing my own background. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I think of myself as in a social science field, even though cultural anthropology often draws on humanistic ways of thinking. And so coming from my own particular sort of disciplinary perspective that way, I want to think through with these three papers sort of a question of methods and of what academic scholarly methods we are using to pursue knowledge about these really fascinating questions of contemporary religious connections and even missionary activity between Chinese and Africans. And so I'll note that all three of these papers, I would argue, are the topic matter that they are addressing are profoundly social phenomena that I think are very amenable to social science methods from a range of different disciplines, certainly not only anthropology. And then, so I was very interested when reading these papers that I think the papers tended towards a more sort of humanistic methodological approach. So, for example, in Conrad John Masabo's paper, he says in his paper that the article adopts a documentary review approach that employs documentary analysis and textual analysis. In Wincharles Coker's paper, he employs methods of semiotic deconstruction, which involves critical textual analysis that he describes in his paper. And I wonder if so the objects of analysis in these papers, I wonder if a consideration of textual analysis and discourse analysis methods might lead us to very different kinds of conclusions than if we were using social science research methods, which of course classically, especially in anthropology, would involve going out and talking to people and asking them about these social phenomena and how they experience it in their own lives. And so perhaps I will begin. I'd like to sort of turn to each of the three papers in turn and just point to some avenues. As I said, I think all three of these papers are absolutely fascinating research avenues. And so I'd like to turn to each of the three papers in turn and just to sort of push a further imagination of where this research could go. And again, from my own perspective, sort of advocating for a social science research methodology. So and I apologize in advance if I mispronounce anyone's name, I'm very sorry. But in Adedeji, Aina, Ademola's excellent paper, so he doesn't have in his paper an explicit discussion of research methods, but he does have three case studies in three different countries that he lays out. And using these case studies, he develops quite fascinating conclusions about contemporary Chinese African religious connections. But sometimes when reading his paper, I really wanted to dig more deeply into the data of the paper and to see more clearly how Ademola was drawing his conclusions from this data. So, for example, in his case study of Ethiopia, Ademola concludes this case study in his paper by saying, there may be Chinese people who identify as Christians within Ethiopia's expanding Chinese population. Given that there are many Christians in China, it is conceivable that some Chinese expats may decide to continue their religious practices while living outside of China. The specific number of Chinese Christians in Ethiopia is still difficult to determine, and throughout time, the population size and makeup may change. And so this is an example of where I think that a social science research methodology could be really fascinating because these are all really interesting questions about contemporary Chinese involvement in Christianity and other religious practices in Ethiopia that I would really want to learn more about as a reader. I'm extremely interested in this topic, and I think that using or I would want to hear more about what methods were used in Ethiopia, as an example, to develop this case study that Ademola then develops into the conclusions in his paper. Similarly, in Conrad John Masabo's case, with this really interesting question of Chinese activity in building up churches in Africa. And Masabo raises this query of, does it mean that China wants to sincerely put Africa closer to God? And I'll note that this relates to Wincharles Coker's paper, because both of them raise questions of motivation, of sort of interior subjective motivation. So in Masabo's paper, it's a question of, is China or Chinese people trying to put Africans closer to God? And in Wincharles Coker's paper, it's a question of, are Chinese doing this as a business activity? Are they doing it just to make money? And in both cases, I think I again would be really fascinated to learn and to hear more about Chinese people speaking about their motivations for engaging in these activities. I think that would really help address these questions at play. When Charles Coker addresses this point, sometimes, and I experience this very often in my own research in Zambia, sometimes it can be extremely difficult to speak with Chinese expatriates in Africa. I think there's often sort of a culture of insularity amongst Chinese migrants in Africa that can make it hard to talk with them directly. But if not talking with them directly, then perhaps talk to the Africans that they are interacting with, that the Chinese migrants, for example, are building churches for, or that the Chinese migrants are bringing into their religious business. How do they understand these social processes at play? I think could provide really interesting insights and perspectives into answering these fascinating questions that these scholars have raised. And I think the question of methods and of how we would use relatively humanistic methodologies such as discourse or text analysis or semiotic deconstruction is most clearly raised in Wincharles Coker's paper. Wincharles Coker and his co-author, I should mention, De-Valera N Botchway. They use as the primary data for their paper 3 YouTube videos. I think that this is a tricky thing to do because in this paper, these two authors use the YouTube videos as if they are windows into a social world. And looking through that window, they then engage in analysis of the social world revealed through the videos. But as we very well know, YouTube videos are not subject to peer review. They're not subject to standards of journalistic ethics. There's very little restrictions on what kind of video someone can upload, how they can edit it in order to make it appear certain ways. And as a result, I watching the videos that these authors have used in their paper, I was not totally convinced that, in fact, we were getting an unvarnished view of a social world. And instead, what I really wanted to hear, and where I think the authors could really push their analysis, is of the YouTube videos as a text, and deconstructing not the social world ostensibly seen through the video, but the video itself as a text. And so I'll just briefly mention, I know I'm running out of time, but a few of the videos mentioned in this paper, I think by looking, for example, at the comment sections of the YouTube videos could help us think more expansively about the semiotic references of these videos. So for example, in the first video in this paper, a video by a YouTube producer named Haruyama. So it ostensibly shows a African man who is accepting money in order to give out Christian blessings. But in the comments, there's a very interesting thing that happens, because in the comments, this very producer who made the video, Haruyama, in reply to another YouTuber's comment, mentions that African pastors are just the same. And I thought that this could be a really interesting opening for comparing the practices of the Chinese pastor to other practices of the prosperity gospel, which are popular throughout the world, including in Ghana. There have been other scholars, for example, Karen Lauterbach and Girish Daswani, who have done excellent social analyses of prosperity gospel activities in Ghana. And insofar as the authors of the paper want to argue that the Chinese pastor is engaging in a practice of simony, of a religious activity that's more that of Simon the Magus than of Jesus and his disciples, I think a connection there between these activities and the wider practices of the prosperity gospel in Ghana could be really fascinating. In the second video that appears in this paper, that of an ostensibly Asian man singing Twi songs, I think it's tricky here because the paper is about Chinese involvement in Christianity and religious activity in Ghana. And the paper notes that it is an Asian man who is singing these songs. But in the YouTube video itself, the caption of the YouTube video suggests that this is not a Chinese man, but that it's actually a Japanese man. And that this congregation may not actually be in Ghana, but may be in Germany. And so I think those are all really like important things to analyze about this text that is constructed of this short segment of a Chinese or Japanese man singing Twi songs, and a more expansive reading of that text would help deepen the analysis possible in this paper. Also, one thing that was not brought up in Wincharles Coker's presentation, but appears in the paper is another video of a Chinese orchestra performing songs, I believe also in Twi. And the authors also point out that this performance as a packed out, sold out performance is also seems like a kind of business activity. But again, looking at the YouTube comments on this video, there's vigorous discussion about whether this orchestra is in fact Chinese. The caption of the video says that it's Chinese, but in the comments, different people say, oh, it's actually Japanese or Peruvian, or one very authoritative sounding comment says, no, I really want to set the record straight. This is a Korean orchestra. And so I think that looking at these YouTube videos as text and thinking about what are the agendas of the people who have created these videos, what were they trying to do, how is this spreading information, but as we know, YouTube videos can also do sometimes misinformation or disinformation. All those processes, I think, would lead to a richer form of textual and discourse analysis. And as to the actual social phenomena that really interest the authors in this paper, I would say that the authors, again, very rightly say that sometimes it can be difficult to approach Chinese expatriates or Chinese migrants in Africa. Sometimes they can be quite standoffish. I have found this in my own experience in Zambia. They can be quite standoffish to people who are not obviously Chinese. That being said, if the author's central hypothesis in this paper by Coker and Botchway, if their central hypothesis is correct, which is that Chinese are engaging in Christian activity in Ghana as a form of capitalist business enterprise in order to make profit, well, I think one thing that's pretty universally true about capitalist business enterprises is that they generally strive to market and advertise themselves and expand their customer base and expand their market share. And I think that it seems very highly plausible to me that if this hypothesis is accurate, that there is Chinese activity to use Christianity as a business activity in Africa, my guess is that they are probably looking for additional customers, and that it should be possible to find that. Yes, and I know, yeah. I'm sorry, I talked too long. I apologize.
No.
I apologize.
Your comments are absolutely very insightful and helpful. and push this conversation forward by a lot. I think the three wonderful presenters and Justin just already put this conversation going. And I believe now both the audience here at the Institute and the audience online, I believe many of you have interesting and provocative questions at this moment. So now let's invite our three speakers here to the front stage. So for the discussion section, for those of you who are here, it's just a like regular talk. If you have questions, just raise up your hands. And for those of you who are joining us virtually, you can use the raise hand function of Zoom, or just type your questions in the chat box. If you choose to type your question, I will then read your question to the audience here. Okay, so now let's start if you have questions. Okay. Yeah. 1 minute. We have a mic for, yeah.
Thank you. Okay. My name is Manu Chodoraj. I was intrigued by all the very interesting presentation. My question pertains two issues. One is my understanding is that China's proselytizing or evangelical activity is primarily focused on Christianity. What dilemmas, if any, that you know of, it poses for Muslim minorities in Africa and in the larger Islamic world? What is their reaction to these proselytizing Christian evangelical activities that China seems to be leading in Africa?
Okay, thank you. Maybe let's collect like around 3 questions, and then the speakers then respond. Okay, then answer. Okay.
Hi, thanks.
Oh, yeah.
Is it on? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah, it's okay.
I have a question for Conrad. I was wondering if we can consider church building to be an investment in infrastructure, in religious infrastructure, and what intellectually that would do to consider that as a infrastructural investment, even if it's unrelated to BRI indexed projects. Thank you.
And then Tencent and David, and perhaps the next round of questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for the exciting papers. I learned a lot from all 3 of them. I want to follow up with what Justin was emphasizing on the issue of methods. And since this conference is called Global China, I think Qinguang Li's article on Global China 20 is quite important. But one of the things she argues, I don't see it quoted in any of the 3 papers. I think since she herself does China Africa, I think it's quite important for all 3 of you to look at Qinguang Li's article in China Quarterly. But one of the things she points out and argues is to look at the non-state actors in Africa-China interactions. And here, I think also she points out the importance of the Chinese migrants, not the recent migrants, but the 19th century migrants who are there in South Africa. And Justin, I think, works on Zambia, but also in Madagascar. If you look at the Chinese religion post reforms or during the reform period, there is an intimate connection between China and the overseas Chinese population, particularly in Southeast Asia. Does that matter? Given, in Madagascar, there are Chinese Baptist Christians in large numbers. So what is the relationship between China and the Chinese migrant communities, the 19th century ones? In Africa, is the relationship different? Because proselytizing is done not through just church building, but also school building. And many of the churches, Chinese churches, were built by the Baptists from Hong Kong. And you see that among many Chinese immigrant communities. So I wonder if that should be looked at, because approaching the overseas Chinese communities is an intimate part of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's not just state to state, but overseas Chinese communities play an important role in that initiative. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the questions. The speakers, maybe you answer in the order of your presentation. Maybe start with Adedeji.
Okay, thank you for the comments and observations. Actually, none of the questions were directed to me, but I want to respond to the last speaker. In my paper, actually, I talked about the humanitarian activities of the Chinese migrants that you actually raised, building of hospitals, providing educational assistance, just like the Western missionaries. I mean, I didn't see much difference. So it was actually in the paper, but I think I wrote, I have a lot of facts in the paper itself, which you might want to look at. Thank you.
So I have a confession to make. I am a very late comer to Chinese-African relations. I'm a senior lecturer in rhetoric and communication studies proper. But yeah, as I was settling down in Yale for a similar conference, I saw this call for the conference, and yeah, with my co-presenter, we worked on something. So I'm very much here to learn. So thank you. Now, I would like to start with the question concerning methods. Yes, I so agree that given it an anthropological basis or perhaps a social science approach would have enriched the data. I so do agree. But as I said, yes, I want to use the term the insularity or the unwillingness of some of the Chinese people to open up to us concerning the activities in religion. Yeah, but we will be going back and look at how to strengthen the data and fine tune it. Now, about China's or Chinese workers proselytization in Africa, evangelization in Africa, and the Muslims' concerns about the growth of Christianity. I think on the contrary, Islam in Africa and for that matter in West Africa is growing in leaps and bounds, and there are concerns that in few years to come, the Muslim front will dominate in Africa. So I think that Muslims are not so worried about this. They have a strategy and they're keeping to their plans. That I know that much. About non-state actors in Africa and Chinese migrant, I guess Masabo can do that for me.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the observation by the discussant about methods. However, in my case, I'm particularly interested in the consequences of Chinese infrastructure. And because of that, that's why I didn't delve much into social science methods, because I wanted to observe from what is already on ground, then see whether the economic logic argued behind that can also translate into influencing evangelization. So it's like once you build a church, as my sister observed there, is an investment. Yes, it's an economic investment. Chinese contractors have made business, but by building that church, the consequence imply that there is an evangelization consequence. In that regard, I see that very activity of China taking a contract to construct a church have facilitated the evangelization mission. That's what I was basically arguing in my paper. And probably that's why, though, even if I could have gone for interviews, I think still I would go back to humanistic method to see what is on the ground and make sense of it. Yes, the views could have added and expanded the scope of the interpretation, but in my case, I was not interested on what Chinese see their consequence, but on what could be the consequences of those particular infrastructure. And that's why I was unable to really delve into social science methods. The observation that churches' investment are not, yes, most of the churches' investments or activities are not per se under the BRI index. But if you read the implication of BRI in Africa, there is this trend of blending every project that Chinese contractors are involved in is BRI, even though it is not in the BRI index. So there is that tendency, and I observe in my paper that not every project that Chinese contractors are involved in is BRI. And especially if I take the case of my focus, Tanzania, we have Chinese contractors, but we have no per se Chinese BRI project as of now, because the project that was to be BRI never materialized. That was Bagamoyo Port project that was shelved by the political authorities in Tanzania. So, but we have more Chinese. So if it comes to Chinese non-state actor, yes, there are some Chinese non-state actor, but we should not forget that China has a method of controlling even those non-Chinese, either through financing, through diplomatic connection, and through banking services that are spreading in Africa. For example, in Tanzania, we have Dengshan Bank, which was established particularly to facilitate Chinese who want to get capital from China easily to Tanzania, to save the challenges of sending money through New York, then to Tanzania. So there is that facilitation. Yes, there are some non-state actors, especially there are small companies that are not linked to the state, and they are operating in Africa. But in the long run, if you see them through the SASAC, you'll find that through the China Africa Fund, most of them are benefiting from that fund. And through that fund, in a backyard, China takes control of those very non-state actors. Yes, there is currently research going on to start non-state actors in Tanzania and Kenya. And I hope to learn more about what will be the implication, especially because we don't, in Tanzania per se, particularly where I do my research, we don't have most of non-state actors apart from those companies that are involved into construction, especially the minor, small projects. But the major projects, most of them are linked to the main Chinese companies. Thank you.
Thank you for the responses. Justin, do you have a word to weigh in here? Or we go to the next round of questions?
I think I'm okay. I already talked too long, so I please go on to the questions from the audience.
Yeah, great. Now, so let's David and Lee and okay.
Yes. So, well, thank you so much, and I want to thank all three of you for preparing these papers, especially given that actually I don't think any of you have previously really been working on religious issues, but it was through other areas that you realized that there's something religious going on, and so that you've really bravely gone out and tried to find some information and really open up some questions and some lines of future research. I think that's really what all of your papers are doing. And for me, one thing that's interesting in these papers, I'm wondering how we see through these papers, both in the way they're written, but also what is talked about in the papers, is how China is perceived in Africa or by Africans. And so there are many things that I wanted to bring up about that, and these are just questions that come to me. One thing is, first of all, that right, because being in Hong Kong, we're extremely conscious of the differences between mainland Chinese, Hong Kongers, Taiwanese, and overseas Chinese. And even as Danson was just saying, there are many generations of overseas Chinese in different places. And so these are actually highly differentiated communities who see things very differently. And so it's kind of like, being in Hong Kong, I forgot that all of this can be blobbed together into one thing called, this China, right? And then it even gets more complicated, because what we see through some of your papers is that Chinese Christian congregations in Africa actually seem to bring together people of these different entities. So we have Chinese Christians from mainland China, from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, and maybe from other places, who actually are joining together in Mandarin congregations in African countries. And so then that brings up the question of, on the one hand, there's the differentiation of ethnic Chinese people from these different political entities and different generations of migration on the one hand, but then we have transnational Christian networks, which actually bring them together. And so there's some incredibly complicated dynamics going on here that we really need to unpack when we're doing this research, to go beyond the fact that they are all Chinese in the sense that they're all ethnically or racially Chinese, but actually behind that, there's actually a lot going on. So that's one thing that that I thought that's important to bring up. And then another and that even extends to the notion, because as Justin brought up, I don't know, and you are Africans, what is the perception? Somebody told me that actually Chinese in some African countries, they're perceived as white people. Maybe in Africa, Japanese and Koreans, is it for African people? It's all the same. It's all Chinese. So, it doesn't matter if they're, so I'm just curious. It actually makes me curious about how what does the word Chinese actually mean? And maybe it means different things, different countries, but how is that perceived? Then a question is about the infrastructures. So Conrad, you talked about so Chinese contractors building churches and church affiliated or church associated buildings. And I think all three papers talked about the Amity printing press in Nanjing is printing most of, or a large number of the Bibles that are being used in Africa. So then the question is, so what does this mean that there are Chinese contractors or printers doing this? And so you asked, does that mean they're trying to bring Africa closer to God? Certainly not, I would say. They're out, the government doesn't want to do that. And these private contractors, or even if they're public, I think they're just in it for the money. But so you're talking about then, but the practical effect, right? Is it promoting evangelization indirectly? But then really the question is, how would it be different if there were other contractors? So if there were no Chinese contractors, would churches be built as quickly? That's the question. Are Chinese contractors facilitating because their contracting is cheaper and quicker or whatever? Are there any factors that mean that Chinese contractors going in is going to lead to more churches being built faster than if they were local contractors or Japanese or French contractors or whatever? So I guess that's really the question. And same with printing presses. If there were no Amity printing press in Nanjing, would that mean that there would be less Bibles in Africa, or would there be other printing presses who would be able to take up all that volume of printing? Then we would see something that is a distinctly Chinese kind of factor in the indirect promotion of evangelization, that they're really doing something that other contractors or printers somehow would not be able to do. So I guess that's the question. It's kind of it's a research question, I suppose. Then also, and it's kind of the same question when we're talking about Wincharles' paper. So, okay, Justin brought up the issue of the YouTube videos, but even if, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me that there are Chinese pastors and congregations who are learning to sing in local languages, because Christian missionaries of all nationalities do that whenever they go to any country. That's part of missionizing strategies. So maybe this YouTube video is kind of fake or whatever, but even if that's the case, it wouldn't surprise me. If they're not doing it now, they will do it. But then what's the difference? Again, that's the question, right? So again, it wouldn't surprise me. There's so much prosperity. It was mentioned, the prosperity gospel is so widespread in Africa, in the United States, and in China. So what's different if Chinese people are doing the same thing? So it also made me wonder about, like, how does the perception when Chinese actors are doing or perceived to be doing the same kind of prosperity gospel that local Christians or missionizing Christians from other countries, when Chinese are doing what the others are doing. So what does that mean for local perceptions among in Ghana or Nigeria when they see Chinese people doing this, that they're not used to seeing that before, but they're actually, or are they doing it differently, or are they doing something? So I think that's an interesting question. And who are these YouTubers who are bringing this up, whether they are making things up or whether they are snipping and editing a phenomenon? But there's clearly, that voice that she's making a commentary on it. What is the agenda? What is she normally talking about? Why is she bringing this up at this point? What narrative is she trying to insert these Chinese Christian practices in Africa into her narrative? Yeah, okay, so that's a lot of questions, but well, it's not only Q&A, but this is also discussion. Oh, and one other thing I just wanted to mention, because this panel really gives us the impression that, oh, China is bringing Christianity to Africa. You really get that. Is that a generalized impression in Africa? But it could be the organization of this conference. And I should point out that there's another panel on Africa next week on the online. And that one involves Islam and Chinese religions. And it's not deliberate that this was divided this way, that the Christian panel is this time. It's only for the panel division was also so that in order to avoid a hybrid conference, so the in-person ones are all together and the online ones are all together. And it just happens to be that we have 3 non-Christian related papers on Africa next week on the online session. So then we have a more complete picture. Yeah.
Okay. Stay tuned to our next section. Okay, so next question goes to this gentleman. Mike.
Okay, I will try to be shorter than David, but I will speak as theologians and anthropologists of Christianity in China. I did some research on Africans in China, and I'm publishing about this. I've been following Hong Kong Baptist missionaries in France, trying to target French people, and that didn't work too well. But my main comment or question is, I think it's very important also to pay attention to the different forms and structures of Chinese Christianity going to Africa. Because it may appear as some kind of broad evangelical theology, but depending on whom, they may have very different ecclesial structures. For instance, we all heard about the Wenzhou model, where it's a corporation of co-workers with a very symbiotic relationship between a community of faith, so almost a ethic moral guild, and a business engagement, which is very different from very evangelical, single hero missionary who go in the wilderness to convert the pagans. That's not the same structure. And I think that's also important to really look at which kind of Christianity we have there and which kind of social structures is coming with that, with all sorts of implications. So going back to the Baptist missionary in France, she was hoping to convert the French, and she ended up converting, or at least connecting with migrants or people who might be residents in France but marginalized. And so again, when we talk about Africa, well, we know there are huge internal migrations among African countries, and I'm very sorry, but as a French, I've never worked on Africa. I'm specialized in Asia, and I'm totally unable to see the differences and track them down. But I'm sure there are many, and I'm sure it's not just one population. And so I'm sure there are many people, African people, who feel as migrants or marginalized people in Africa and might resonate to the discourse brought by those Chinese missionaries. I don't know, but just saying that, yeah, there are probably more attention to pay to the kind of religious communities that they're trying to build beyond the apparent evangelical style in their discourse. And I stop here.
Okay, the next question, Ji.
Thank you very much for the wonderful sharing. I've learned a lot. I'm a historian working on history of Christianity in China. So following David and Michelle's question, we know that it seems it's not Chinese who brought Christianity to Africa. We know a large number of missionaries who worked in Africa in the past, from Europe, from America, French missionaries, Catholic and Protestant. So I'm very curious, can we compare Chinese missionary movement to the previous ones or the Western ones? We witnessed Western missionary movements in different countries in Africa. So do you think we can compare this Chinese missionary movement with Western ones? And if yes, did you find any differences between them? Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for the questions. Now it's the turn of the speakers.
Thank you very much for your very, very interesting observation and questions. Let me start with the last speaker. To compare in my paper, I think I did that. I tried to compare, I tried to look at what is the difference between Western missionary movements and the Chinese. I couldn't find any difference. The Western missionaries movements, they brought Christianity, they helped in setting up of schools, hospitals. Of course, they also attached to the resources in Africa and doing business. The same thing with the Chinese. They came mainly for economic reasons, but they are also involved in missionary works. So I really couldn't find any difference. And of course, we also need to understand that in Africa there are traditional religions that are, that the people are, well, let me say, used to before the Westerners and the Easterners, like we call it, all came to Africa. So we have various traditional religions. At the last count, I think more than 300 all over Africa, different religions. So, but in Africa right now, a lot of people are either Christians or Muslims, And to answer David's question, Professor, about how Chinese are perceived in Africa, I was telling the chair yesterday that whenever you see a white person Of course, there are similarities. If you look at Michelle and maybe Rundong, you can see some difference, maybe the hair or the face. So, but if you see his face, anybody that looks like this in Africa is a Chinese, according to the people. You know, but if you are literate and you try to read about them, you will know that there are differences. So in my paper, for instance, I mentioned that even the South Koreans were already doing missionary work in Africa before the Chinese. That's from my own perspective. Then there are also people from Taiwan, Hong Kong, you know, especially in the Baptist churches. So I mentioned that. Then, of course, you see, but, you know, the Chinese in Nigeria, for instance, there are so many, especially in Lagos, because if I'm not in school in Ile-Ife, I'm in Lagos. So when you go to the shopping malls, restaurants, hotels, you find the Chinese everywhere. Well, I kind of like them in a way because of their work ethic. I mean, they work a lot. And so they recruit, most of the recruitment they do in Africa, most of us complain about the timing of the kind of workload they have to do. You know, so they will say the Chinese are slave drivers, they put it that way, you know, that you have to work, you know, all through the night and all that, you know, but I mean, they are so involved in the African economy majorly, not in politics, because in the fivefold foreign policy approach by President Xi Jinping, they have a pattern that they don't like interfering in the internal affairs of African countries, which is quite different from what people from the West are doing, especially France. So let me not talk about that. Then the Amity printing process, what if they are not producing the Bibles? You know, of course, China is not the only place that produce Bibles. We also have several companies in the West, you know, missionaries that they give Bible freely to Africans. And I think we have embraced Christianity even more than the people that brought Christianity to Africa. If you go to Africa today, they are no longer practicing the traditional religion as they used to. So it's either you are a Christian or you are a Muslim in Africa. That's my perspective. Let me stop there and allow my colleagues to answer. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. So the image of China in Ghana, my country, it's a mythical one and a suspicious one for that matter. In Ghana, the Chinese migrated inside the mining belt or the mining areas of the country, and therefore it is believed that the contract is so disproportionate to the disadvantage of Ghanaians. And so many Ghanaians, anytime we see the Chinese, we see Chinese as illegal miners who are polluting our waters, who are doing danger to our forest belt and things of the sort. But with time, the image is evolving because now Chinese corporations are beginning to do legitimate business in quotes with the settlement or with the building of Confucius Institute in the Ivy League universities in Ghana, like my own university, Cape Coast, University of Ghana, and one in the middle belt of Ghana. A new image is popping up. So people are beginning to be accepting of the Chinese culture and the Chinese language because it opens up job opportunities. You have a lot of people who are now studying Chinese, traveling to Chinese centers of learning and the rest. So the image is evolving. Now, how does that play into religion? So in our study, we realized that a number of these Chinese operatives or workers are not into so-called orthodox religious bodies, like into Catholicism, or they are not into Protestant movement, but they are normally into the evangelical movement, the firebrand kind of Christianity, number one. Number two, they tend to be leaders of these churches. So how is it that if you are a Chinese national from China operate in Africa, you are not simply a floor member of the church. But when you seem to be in an African church, you seem to have a leading role. And so that raises suspicions as to what is the motivation for this level of involvement in a local African church. And if we did if time allowed and we watch the video as Justin taught, I think that the video where the pastor was singing and praying in tongues was also in a church in Ghana, the Church of Pentecost, which is one of the fastest growing church in Africa. And so, and it's headquartered in Ghana, and it was started by Ghanaians through a foreign missionary who came to Ghana, but the church is owned by Ghanaians. So you have this Asian, and I'm happy just to realize that it was difficult to know the nationality of the men, but we, as Bergen Lackman would say, stereotypes allow us to, to put people into molds. But basically, that was a nation.
Okay, thank you for the observation. So how is China perceived in Tanzania? We historically, we did have some few Chinese who came in the early time when there was the first movement, or the famous movement that my brother mentioned, but more Chinese came during the German time when they were employed as workers for railway construction. So few remain, because the record said they came like 2,000. So at the end of the work, only 600, I think, remain. So that was the first movement. The other movement, the other wave of Chinese was more during the Tazara, construction of Tazara. So we had more Chinese coming to construct Tazara. Some have remained, some went back to China. And the third wave is from the 2000s, especially when Tanzania embarked on infrastructure. So this time we saw many who came as contractors. So those are some of the waves of Chinese movement in Africa, in Tanzania. So how do we perceive Chinese? We perceive Chinese as non-religious, because Tanzania contacted more of communist China. And as countries that support one China policy, Tanzania, we don't differentiate Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, we call them Chinese. So Tanzania is pro one China policy. So it's very hard to differentiate. For me, if somebody says I'm from Taiwan, I understand, but the majority don't make such differences. Now, what is happening in the infrastructure? Yes, previously, the infrastructure were built by French, German engineers. And that time, it was because it was the missionaries that were supporting the construction. These days, African churches are financing their own churches due to decline of religion in Europe, decline of funding in Europe. So contracting a Western contractor, the expense is too high when you compare with Chinese. Now, if you bring in within the broader understanding of Chinese contribution to real estate development in Africa, it's hardly to see any other non-Western as having impact in Africa. So that's why this concept of China came in. And for my case, I'm just looking at the consequence of these economic projects that translate into religion. So printing, yes, they may print, but China prints more cheaply as compared to Europe. So in most cases, the affordability logic drives the more Africans to contract Chinese contractors. In the long run is what I'm trying to say, that they are contributing towards this construction. So the other aspect is the material. Yeah. We depend on materials for construction from China as opposed to Europe. And that's why I was trying to draw that link between Chinese contractors and churches.
Okay. yeah, thanks, Conrad, and the other two speakers and all the people who posed the questions. I think this conversation can go on and on, but unfortunately, time flies fast, and it's a time to wrap up our panel. And let's give another round of applause to the three wonderful presentations and our wonderful discussant. So the panel comes to an end, but let's keep conversation going. Thanks.